The second wave had hit at dawn, and Sera had been running ever since. She did not stop to look back when the pulse towers along the merchant bridge collapsed. She heard the sequence of detonations as a staggered drumroll behind her, felt the pressure wave push through the smoke filling Carville Street, and kept moving. Her left arm was bleeding from a glass cut she hadn't noticed taking. Her jacket was wrong side out because she had used the inner lining to tie a bandage around the arm of a woman she'd found in the Carville Street underpass. And the woman had told her the Eastern Transit Corridor was flooded before Sera had to leave her behind. Tam was in Sector 9. Sera was in Sector 4. Between them was everything the Kelvari's second wave had touched. She had last seen her brother 4 hours ago, when the first pulse had swept the city's lower power grid, and the residential block they'd been sheltering in lost its emergency lighting. Tam was 9 years old, and he was with the building's evacuation coordinator, a steady-handed older man named Breck who had walked the residents through Protocol Amber twice in the previous year and knew exactly where he was taking them. Sera had been outside when the pulse hit 2 streets away, trying to reach the nearest civil defense relay station because her wristband had gone dark and she needed to know what was coming next. What had come next was the second wave. The Kelvari were a hive-mind faction. That much was in the public record, and Sera had grown up absorbing the defense briefings the way other kids absorb sports commentary. 32 years ago, the Kelvari had passed through this system and designated Earth a candidate for reclamation. They had not landed then, only catalogued. The Defense Council had spent 32 years deciding exactly what to expect when they returned and building systems calibrated to each projected strike. The Kelvari's reclamation method was sequential, waves, not a single assault. Break the infrastructure first, then the communications, then the ground-level resistance, then walk through whatever remained. The Defense Council's answer to sequential strikes had been sequential hardening. The power grid had 2 shadow layers beneath it. The communications network had a tertiary mesh that ran on atmospheric relay nodes mounted on buildings throughout the city, independent of any buried cable and independent of any orbital asset. The evacuation corridors built into the city's infrastructure over the past 32 years did not appear on any public map. Sera knew the corridors. Her mother had been an infrastructure engineer on the Northern District Integration Team, and she had taught Sera the routes the same way she'd taught her to tie her boots, methodically, with patience, with the expectation that the knowledge would one day be needed. Today was that day. She ducked into the doorway of a collapsed supply depot on Carville's east edge and checked the building number against the notation in her head. This was it. She found the access panel behind a rusted meter housing on the depot's south interior wall, pressed the 4-point sequence her mother had drilled into her until she could do it in the dark, and heard the mechanism disengage. The corridor beyond was dark, dust-thick, and angled downward at a steady slope. Emergency strips along the floor edge gave off a faint amber light, passive chemical luminescence, no power required. She pulled the panel shut behind her and moved. The second wave had been the swarm component. The Kelvari's hive logic used biological release agents, not pathogens, but disorientation compounds, aerosolized and dispersed at low altitude, designed to suppress organized group behavior and drive populations into uncoordinated movement patterns. The Defense Council had known this was coming. The city's atmospheric processors had been seeded with countermeasure particulates 6 months ago, triggered at the first confirmed Kelvari orbital insertion. The swarm compounds were still present in the open air. Sera's jacket collar was pulled up over her nose, but their behavioral effect was reduced to a manageable discomfort, a faint pressure behind the eyes, a slight tunnel in peripheral vision. Unpleasant, not crippling. The Kelvari's projections, she understood, did not account for countermeasures. They had catalogued Earth 32 years ago and built their reclamation sequence around what they had seen then. She moved fast through the corridor, Every 400 meters there was a direction marker etched into the floor strip, sector designations and distance notations. At the first junction she turned east. The slope leveled out. She could hear nothing from above, which meant either the streets were quiet or the corridor's acoustic insulation was holding. She hoped it was the corridor. At the second junction the corridor branched. The eastern branch was sealed, a thick pressure door with a green indicator light above it. Green meant the section beyond was intact and accessible. She took it. The pressure door opened onto a wider space. A horizontal transit section, higher ceilinged, with benches along one wall and a cluster of people sitting on them. 7 adults, 2 children, a teenager. The teenager, a girl about Sera's age with a split lip and a dazed expression, was holding a younger child on her lap. A man near the far end of the benches was working a manual relay unit, trying to raise a signal. Sera stopped. Anyone from Sector 9? Anyone know the Breck-led group from the Aldrin residential block? The man with the relay unit looked up. Aldrin block was evacuated to the Sector 9 overflow shelter. Breck's group got there ahead of the second wave. That's the last I have. Something uncoiled in Sera's chest. Not relief, not yet, but a direction. Tam was ahead of the wave. He was in the overflow shelter. She knew where the overflow shelters connected to the corridor network. How long has the second wave been active? She asked. 2 hours and 40 minutes since the swarm dispersal. The man's voice was calm in the practiced way of someone who had memorized how to sound calm. Defense Council is broadcasting on the tertiary mesh. The counters are working. Population disorientation is running below 15% of the Kelvari's projected effectiveness. He paused. Third wave is projected inside the next 90 minutes. She had known the third wave was coming. Everyone who had read the briefings knew the Kelvari's third strike was the ground insertion. Physical descent assets, armored units, direct contact engagement. The wave that was supposed to walk through a population, already disoriented and leaderless. Sera had also read what the Defense Council had prepared for it. I need to reach Sector 9, she said. The man with the relay unit pointed south along the transit section. Follow the amber floor to the junction, then take the second left. There's a ladder ascent point at the end of that corridor. It comes up inside the Sector 9 overflow shelter itself, designed for exactly this. She thanked him and moved. The corridor narrowed again beyond the transit section. She counted her paces, old habit, another thing her mother had taught her, a way of keeping the mind anchored when the body was running on stress and not enough sleep. At junction markers, she did not hesitate. The route was clear in her memory. She had walked simulations of this network with her mother in the years before her mother's posting moved her to the Southern District. The simulations had felt abstract then, a kind of game played with paper maps in the evenings. They did not feel abstract now. The amber strips were steady. The ceiling was intact. She passed one section where water was dripping through a seam in the upper structure. The swarm release vehicles had impacted structures across the district, and some of the damage was going to be structural, but the drip was minor and the floor was not flooded. She stepped around it and kept moving. At the second left she found the ladder. It was vertical, steel-runged, set into a narrow shaft. The indicator above it glowed green. She began to climb. The hatch at the top was latched from this side. She pushed it open and came up into noise, light, and the controlled, organized sound of the overflow shelter operating at capacity. The Sector 9 overflow shelter occupied the 3 basement levels of the Carville District Administrative Building, which had been built 30 years ago with the shelter function as a primary design criterion rather than an afterthought. The ceiling was high. The lighting was bright. There were people everywhere, sorted by the orderly logic of an evacuation system that had been rehearsed until the rehearsal was faster than the panic. Civil defense, volunteers in yellow vests moved among the groups, carrying supplies and relay units, and the steady visible presence of people who knew what they were doing. Sera climbed out of the hatch, dropped it shut and scanned the room. Tam saw her first. He came through the crowd at a run, 9 years old, slightly too large for his age, wearing the red jacket she had given him 2 birthdays ago with the zipper pull that read "Never Stop" in small stamped letters. His face was dirty, and his eyes were bright with something that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, the specific expression of a child who has spent hours being told everything is fine and has not entirely believed it. She caught him. He hit her like a thrown weight and she held him, and the arm with the glass cut sent a bright flare of pain up into her shoulder, and she did not care at all. "I heard the merchant bridge," he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I was already past it," she said. He pulled back far enough to look at her face. She could see him cataloging the blood on her sleeve, the inside-out jacket, the grime. She watched him make a decision about each item and file it away, because he had always processed things the way their mother did, methodically, in sequence, and without dwelling. "Breck said the 3rd wave is the hard one," Tam said. "Breck is right. He also said the Defense Council knew it was coming for 32 years. Also right." She found Breck in the south section of the 2nd basement level, standing over a relay unit with 2 civil defense coordinators. He was a broad man in his 60s, with the steady presence of someone who had spent decades thinking carefully about bad days. He nodded at Sera when he saw her, not surprised. Exactly, more like something confirmed. "Your brother said you'd come through the corridors," Breck said. He was right. 3rd wave is 12 minutes out. Ground insertion, armored descent units, Kelvari forward contact formation. He said it without drama, the way a builder describes a load-bearing problem, something to be solved, not feared. The city's response systems are live. Above us, right now, there are 37 atmospheric intercept platforms in active deployment across this district alone. The transit rail network has been reconfigured as an automated barrier grid at street level. Every descent approach corridor the Kelvari can use from their current orbital insertion angle runs directly over a ground-to-atmosphere engagement array. He paused. They are about to walk their forward assault into a prepared position. The only variable is how quickly they understand what they've found. And how much damage they do before they understand it, Sera said. "Yes," Breck said, "that is always the variable." The 3rd wave hit 11 minutes later. Sera did not see it directly. None of them in the shelter did. What they heard was the deep structural percussion of the intercept platforms firing, a sound like a slow, continuous drumbeat that traveled through the building's floor and walls, and up through the bench she and Tam were sitting on. The relay units in the shelter carried the Defense Council's broadcast. Armored descent units intercepted at 43% above projected engagement altitude. Kelvari forward formation disrupted on approach. Ground contact count below 8% of projected insertion strength. The Kelvari's 3rd wave, designed to walk through a broken city, had walked into a grid of interlocking engagement systems built over 32 years. It had not been broken. It had been waiting. The interception broadcast updated at 6-minute intervals. Tam sat beside Sera with his shoulder against hers, listening to each update with the focused attention of someone memorizing the data. At the 4th update, the language shifted. Kelvari rear units in orbital withdrawal. At the 5th, forward insertion assets recalled. At the 6th, which came out of sequence and with a different tone in the broadcast voice, Kelvari command signature has ceased transmission on all monitored frequencies. The fleet is withdrawing from insertion depth. Breck read the 6th update twice. He looked at the civil defense coordinator beside him and said nothing. The coordinator also said nothing. Sera looked at Tam. He was doing the math she was also doing, 3 waves, each projected to compound the last, each instead running into 32 years of prepared answers. Not a lucky defense. Not improvised resistance. A system built for exactly this sequence, calibrated to exactly this enemy, held by institutional patience that did not make for exciting stories but made for very effective outcomes. "They thought they were coming back to finish something," Tam said. "They were," Sera said. "We just finished it before they got here." He thought about this for a moment. What happens now? She considered it seriously. The city would need repair. The merchant bridge would have to be rebuilt. The woman she'd left in the underpass, she needed to find out if that woman had made it to shelter. "Now we go back up," she said. "There's a lot of work." He stood beside her. He was, she noted, already almost as tall as her shoulder. She would have to stop thinking of him as small. He had not been small today. He had been where he was supposed to be, had listened to the people who knew the plan, had waited without breaking. That was not a small thing. She took his hand, not because he needed the guidance, but because she wanted to, and they walked toward the shelter's main ascent, where the civil defense volunteers were already organizing the first group to return to the surface. Above them, the city was still smoking in places. The sky above the smoke was clear and very bright, the kind of pale morning light that comes after something difficult has passed. The intercept platforms were still visible if you knew where to look, dark geometric shapes hanging at high altitude, patient and exact. The Kelvari fleet was gone from the near-orbital positions. It had not been destroyed. It had withdrawn, which was a different thing, and the distinction mattered. It meant they had understood, finally, what they were looking at. It meant the message had been received. Sera emerged into the morning with her brother beside her, and the city's work already beginning around them. And she did not look up at the empty sky with triumph or with grief. She looked at it the way her mother had taught her to look at the systems, with the steady attention of someone who knows the work is ongoing, who knows the next task is already in front of her, and who has no interest in waiting to be asked.